Hi, and welcome back to the 4-Minute Mull, where the agenda today is kidney malfunction and doping defenses. This, of course, comes in the aftermath of yesterday's L'Equipe report that Chris Froome would use this kidney malfunction argument as a way to try and explain his very elevated levels of salbutamol in last year's Vuelta victory. According to the article, the argument will go that Froome's kidneys were not functioning optimally in the days leading up to the test. The result was the accumulation or the storage of salbutamol day after day, and then all of it was released into the urine at once, which explains how he managed to deliver a result that was twice the legal limit. Now you can imagine that there's going to be some hefty and very detailed renal physiology that will underpin or support this theory. And of course the UCI will have the opportunity to provide their own expert who comes at it from the opposite direction, and that could get quite murky and complicated to follow. Also, because we have no specific details, it's impossible and pointless, I guess, at this point to try and evaluate whether this is a plausible explanation. That's also a good thing for both of us because I'm by no means a renal physiologist, and so for me to try and do a deep dive into the detail of the argument is probably doing everyone a disservice, so I'll steer clear of that and stick to high level. And on that note, a couple of thoughts. Number one, interesting to see some of the reaction. I guess unsurprisingly, a lot of it was cynical, disbelieving, and there were a fair few humorous tweets as well, ranging from invoking Froome's history with asthma, bilharzia. We've had chest infections, bronchitis, typhoid fever, I think was there at one point. And I think by now it brings to 7 the number of medical conditions that Froome has had to overcome in order to win his Grand Tour. So a good few people brought that up. Paul Kimmage was short and to the point, the dog ate my kidneys. And then this one for me was the winner of the day, both clever and humorous, invoking the Journal of Fantasy Nephrology to try and poke fun at the defense strategy. On a more serious note, this is a tweet from Roger in which he offers his appraisal. And basically what he's saying here is that he interprets this to mean that Sky and Froome and the lawyers and medical people have gone away and they've attempted to recreate the positive test in a controlled experimental setting. Now, they are entirely entitled to do this. In fact, they're almost compelled to, because at the hearing, Froome will have to go to that panel and present to them a reasonable explanation for how a legal dosage of the drug can produce an adverse finding. And so he's got to explain what happened in the middle in order to cause that. And the way athletes do that is with these controlled experiments. And what Roger is suggesting is that Sky have gone away and done this and failed, and therefore are now reaching for what is basically last resort territory. And I can see this entirely plausible. Sky going away and trying to test things like dehydration and fatigue and exertion and so forth, and then never being able to recreate that value of 2,000 nanograms per milliliter, and now offering the renal problems as their explanation. It's a little bit like knocking the dominoes down, and one by one they fall, and they're falling all the way through to the end, and eventually you're left with one domino left standing, and that one is called kidney malfunction. So that's one theory, and part of me, I'll admit, leans towards that. There is another part, however, that leans in the opposite direction. And the reason I say that is because when this all went down in December last year, I actually heard from a couple of sources who were quite close to the situation, and I think quite knowledgeable, that this kidney issue was going to be offered as a defense. And that was back in mid-December. Now, if that's true, then it means that this kidney issue is not the last resort, but was actually on the table from the beginning. And I'm not sure whether it was just one of many things on the table, and they've now, kind of by process of eliminating every other plausible explanation, been left with it, or whether it was always going to be their play. Simply don't know. The other thing I heard is that when Sky and Froome were informed of this test result, they were quite aggressive in trying to get hold of all Chris Froome's Vuelta doping samples. In other words, he was tested a number of times in that race, and they wanted all of those, even the negative ones. And the reason that would be true, or the case rather, is because every single one of those doping controls is a dot. Think of it as a dot. And what Froome is trying to do is to join the dots in order to create a picture that offers a plausible explanation for his test result. And so is it possible that Sky have managed to obtain all those doping controls, those dots, Is it possible that those dots have been joined to support the idea of a kidney malfunction? I don't know the answer to those. Only time will reveal that. But that's one possibility that came out of yesterday, thinking about this kidney malfunction option or defense. Where does that leave us? It leaves Froome with having to go to that hearing and prove conclusively that there was a kidney malfunction. He could do that either using data that already exists in the doping samples, or he could do that by recreating the situation, which I think is very difficult. The one point I would make is that remember that a kidney malfunction is a non-specific thing. It's not going to affect only salbutamol. It's going to affect a whole host of other things that the kidneys are responsible for, both in the plasma and in the urine. And so it's not impossible to imagine that there are other variables, things like urea, creatinine, pH, osmolality, specific electrolytes, that might support or refute the argument that there was a kidney issue. And so those are the details that we will look for in coming months. If he goes to that hearing, by the way, and he can't provide conclusive evidence for a kidney malfunction, then the process should find him guilty of a doping offense and ban him. And the reason for that is that once there's been this adverse analytical finding, the onus or the burden of proof is now on Froome to show that he wasn't doping. So he has to provide the alternative explanation. In the absence of that alternative, it should be deemed to be, as I say, a doping offense. And so that's what's at stake. And now what we can add is that in the center of this is going to be renal physiology and two groups of medical experts backed by lawyers arguing about this complexity. It's an extremely murky picture that is happening as the cycling season is now underway, and there's a couple of big races, the Giro and the Tour, where Froome will be apparently competing as one of sport's big draw cards with this axe hanging over his head. It's just not a good look for sport, and this whole process, as it is threatening to be drawn out more and more and more, makes it even more and more of a farce. Maybe in months from now, we'll be able to have another one of these chats and actually talk about the specific details and the outcome, but that may be a long time coming.